The twin paradox. It is one of the strangest and most fascinating ideas in physics. It starts with two twins who are exactly the same age. One of them stays on Earth, while the other climbs aboard a spaceship and takes off into space at a speed close to the speed of light. After traveling far away and then returning to Earth, the twin who went on the space journey comes back younger than the one who stayed behind. They were born on the same day, but now they're different ages. How can that be? At first, this sounds impossible. We're used to time moving at the same pace for everyone. 1 minute for you is 1 minute for me. But when things move at very high speeds, especially speeds near the speed of light, time doesn't behave the way we expect. This idea comes from Einstein's theory of relativity, and the twin paradox is one way to explore what that theory really means. So let's walk through it step by step. According to special relativity, time slows down for objects that are moving very fast. This effect is called time dilation. If someone were to watch the fast-moving twin from Earth, they would see that twins clock ticking more slowly than their own. Everything on the spaceship, breathing, heartbeats, even aging, would happen more slowly compared to life on Earth. Now, from the traveling twins' perspective, things look a little different. Because of relativity, they see the Earth as moving instead of themselves. That might make it seem like the twin on Earth should age more slowly instead. So who's right? That's where the paradox part comes in. It looks like both twins should think the other one is aging slower, which seems like a contradiction. The key to solving this lies in the fact that the situation isn't perfectly equal. The twin on Earth stays in one place the whole time. The traveling twin, however, changes direction and speed, first flying away from Earth, then turning around, and finally coming back. That change in direction means the traveling twin experiences acceleration and deceleration, while the twin on Earth does not. That small difference breaks the symmetry, and it explains why the traveling twin ends up younger. When the spaceship returns, the twin who stayed on Earth may have aged 20 years, while the one who traveled at near light speed might have aged only 10. From Earth's point of view, the traveling twin's clock was ticking slower the whole time, and when they came back, it showed. What seemed like just a few years for one twin was much longer for the other. This isn't just a fun science fiction idea, it's real science. In fact, scientists have tested the effects of time dilation using atomic clocks. When one clock is flown on a fast-moving plane and then brought back, it shows a slightly different time than the one that stayed on the ground. The difference is tiny, but it's there, and it matches what Einstein's theory predicts. The twin paradox forces us to rethink what we believe about time. We usually think of time as fixed and steady, the same for everyone. But relativity tells us that time is more flexible than that. It can stretch and shrink depending on how fast you're moving and how much gravity you're experiencing. There's also something emotional and human about this paradox. It's not just about clocks and physics. It's about two people who start life together and end up separated by something as strange as time itself. When they reunite, one has lived through more life than the other. It challenges our ideas of identity, memory, and connection. The twin paradox is more than a scientific puzzle. It's a window into a universe that doesn't always work the way our everyday experiences suggest. It teaches us that even something as constant as time can behave in unexpected ways when we push the limits of speed and motion. And while most of us won't be flying at the speed of light anytime soon, the lessons from this paradox remind us how deeply strange and wonderful the universe really is. Sword and shield. A traveling merchant comes to a marketplace claiming he sells the best weapons in the world. In one hand, he holds a sword. This sword, he says proudly, can cut through anything. On the other hand, he holds a shield. And this shield, he adds, can block anything. At first, the crowd was amazed. Both items sound incredible, but then someone in the crowd asks a simple question. What happens if you try to strike the shield with the sword? And just like that, the logic behind the merchant's claims collapses. This is the heart of the sword and shield paradox. It's also known in philosophical terms as the paradox of the unstoppable force meeting the immovable object. Two absolute powers are presented, one that cannot be stopped and one that cannot be overcome. The problem is, they can't both be true at the same time. If the sword truly cuts through anything, it should slice through the shield. But if the shield truly blocks everything, then it should stop the sword. The two ideas cancel each other out. The very act of testing one destroys the truth of the other. What makes this paradox so interesting is that it pushes us to think about contradictions. At first, it seems like both things can exist, but the moment you put them together, the logic breaks. You're left with a clash between two ideas that can't live in the same world. It's not just about weapons. It's about the limits of absolute claims. When something is described as unstoppable or unbeatable, we often don't stop to think about what that really means until we see it challenged. This kind of paradox also shows up in everyday thinking. Think about arguments or opinions that are presented as absolute. For example, someone might say, "I never lose an argument," while another person claims, "I can convince anyone." If they meet, what happens? The moment two unbeatable forces face each other, their absoluteness starts to crumble. The same thing can happen in politics, debates, or even relationships when people hold extreme positions without considering that reality is more complex than simple all-or-nothing claims. In some versions of the story, the merchant is left speechless. He realizes that his claims can't both be true, and the crowd sees that he's either lying or caught in a contradiction. In that sense, the story becomes a warning about selling or believing in ideas that don't hold up under pressure. It reminds us that we should question bold claims, especially when they sound too perfect. The paradox also appears in science fiction and philosophy in different forms. When people ask, can an all-powerful being create a rock so heavy that even they can't lift it? They're asking the same kind of question. It's about the limits of power, logic, and how far language can stretch before it breaks. These questions don't always have answers, but they challenge us to think more carefully about what we believe. At its core, the sword and shield paradox is about conflict, not just between weapons, but between ideas. It shows how two things that seem impressive or powerful on their own can fall apart when put together. That's what makes it more than a story. It's a reflection of how our minds work, how we handle contradiction, and how we search for truth in a world full of bold claims. So the next time you hear someone say something can never fail or never be beaten, think of the sword and the shield. Ask yourself what happens when that claim meets something equally strong. Because sometimes the real power isn't in being unbeatable, it's in knowing where your limits are. The stability in stability paradox. It deals with conflict, safety, and how people or nations behave when they feel protected by powerful weapons, especially nuclear weapons. The strange part is that the more secure and stable things seem at the big level, the more risky and unstable they can become at the smaller level. Let's break it down. Imagine two powerful countries, both with nuclear weapons. Each knows that if they start a full-scale war, it could lead to total destruction on both sides. Because of that, they avoid direct, large-scale conflict. This creates a kind of balance. Neither side wants to risk everything, so they stay cautious, careful. This big picture piece is the stability part. But here comes the twist. Since both sides know they're unlikely to use their most dangerous weapons, they might start taking smaller risks. They might get involved in smaller fights, support rebels in other countries, or test each other in ways that stop just short of all-out war. Why? Because they believe the other side won't respond with full force. These smaller conflicts or indirect battles are the instability part. So you get this strange situation. Nuclear weapons make big wars less likely, but they can also make small wars more common. This is the core of the paradox. Stability at the top creates space for instability at the bottom. You can see examples of this in history. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union avoided fighting each other directly, but they were involved in many smaller conflicts around the world: Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan. They supported different sides in these wars, knowing that as long as they didn't directly attack each other, nuclear war could be avoided. The world avoided total destruction, but many smaller deadly wars still happened. The paradox doesn't just apply to nuclear powers or world politics. It can show up in everyday situations too. Think about sports. When two teams are so evenly matched that neither wants to take a big risk, they might play more aggressively in smaller, safer ways, like playing rough or using tricks to gain an edge. Or think of people in arguments. If they know a big fight would ruin a relationship, they might instead take smaller jabs, thinking those won't cross the line. The stability-instability paradox helps explain why conflict doesn't always vanish when people or nations gain powerful protection. It's not just about having strength, it's about how that strength changes behavior. When people feel safe from the worst consequences, they may push the limits in other areas. It also shows why peace isn't always as simple as it seems. Just because two powerful countries aren't openly fighting doesn't mean there's real peace. There could still be tension bubbling under the surface, showing up in smaller ways that still cause harm. This paradox also reminds us that true stability isn't just about fear of big destruction. It's about trust, communication, and the ability to solve problems before they grow. If two sides are only avoiding war because they're afraid of losing everything, then peace is fragile. Real, lasting peace needs more than just powerful weapons or strong defenses. It needs understanding and a willingness to talk and compromise. In the end, the stability-instability paradox reveals a deep truth about human behavior. When we feel completely safe from the biggest dangers, we might take smaller risks that can still cause harm. It's a warning that even in times of great security, we need to be careful, thoughtful, and aware of how our actions affect others. Peace is not just the absence of big war, it's also the careful management of all the little tensions that can lead to trouble if left unchecked. The ship of Thesius Paradox. There is a famous ship owned by the hero Thesius. Over time, its wooden parts start to rot. So, one by one, each plank, beam, and sail is replaced with a new one. Eventually, not a single piece of the original ship is left. The question is it still the same ship? At first, it might seem like a trick question. Of course it's the same ship, right? After all, it was repaired slowly, carefully, keeping the shape, the design, and even the name. But then you start to wonder, if nothing of the original remains, what makes it the same? Is a ship just the sum of its parts, or is there something more, something invisible that ties all those pieces together into an identity? Now imagine that someone collected all the old, original parts of the ship as they were removed. Over time, they use those parts to build a second ship using the exact same design. This new ship is made of all the original materials, while the first one only has new parts. So now the question gets even harder. Which one is the real ship of Theseus? This paradox touches on the idea of identity and change, not just for ships, but for people, objects, and even ideas. Think about yourself. You were once a baby, then a child, now an adult. Your body has changed, your thoughts have changed, your memories have shifted. Some scientists say most of the cells in your body are replaced over time. Are you still the same person you were years ago? The ship of Theseus shows how tricky it can be to pin down what makes something itself. Is it the materials, the shape, the function, or something deeper, like the story behind it? In the case of the ship, some might say it stays the same because it continues to serve the same purpose and carries the same name. Others might argue that once every part is replaced, it becomes something new, even if it looks exactly the same. This paradox isn't just for philosophers sitting in quiet rooms. It shows up in real life more often than you'd think. Think about an old family house that's been remodeled many times, with new walls, new floors, and new windows. Is it still the same house your grandparents lived in? Or consider a classic car that's had every part swapped out over the years. Is it still the original car? Even technology raises the same questions. When a computer or phone gets repaired or upgraded part by part, at what point is it no longer the original device? This also happens with companies, organizations, or even bands. A music band might change every member over the years. New singers, new guitarists, new styles. Is it still the same band? The ship of Theseus reminds us that identity isn't always black and white. It's often shaped by perspective, history, and how we choose to see things. Some people focus on continuity and story, believing something is the same as long as its journey continues. Others focus on the parts and say change means something new has been created. In the end, the paradox doesn't have a clear answer, and maybe that's the point. It pushes us to think more deeply about what we mean when we say something is the same. It shows how complex even simple things can become when we ask the right questions. Whether you believe the ship stays the same or becomes something new, the real value is in the conversation it opens and the way it makes us reflect on our own identity, memories, and understanding of change. The Sorites Paradox. It starts with something ordinary, like a heap of sand. If you have 1,000 grains of sand in a pile, you'd probably call it a heap. But what if you remove just one grain? It's still a heap, right? Remove another one, still a heap. But if you keep doing this, one grain at a time, eventually you'll be left with just one grain. No one would call that a heap. So where exactly did the heap stop being a heap? That's the heart of the Sorites Paradox. It's about how small changes, when added up over time, create big changes, without us noticing when or how it happened. The name Sorites comes from the Greek word for heap, and this idea has been debated by philosophers for thousands of years. At first glance, it might seem like a silly puzzle. Who cares about heaps of sand? But the paradox isn't really about sand. It's about how we use language, how we draw lines, and how we define things that don't have sharp edges. Many of the words we use every day, like tall, bald, rich, old, or even kind, don't have exact meanings. If someone loses one hair, are they bald? If someone is given $1, are they rich? These questions don't have clear answers. And that's exactly the problem Sorites is pointing out. Let's take another example. Suppose you meet someone who is 5 feet 11 inches tall. You might not call them short, but what if they were 5 feet 10 inches? Still not short. What about 5 feet 9? Step by step, you move down. At some point, you'd start calling them short. But where exactly is that line? It's hard to say because the difference between one height and the next is so tiny. But the overall result, over many small steps, becomes clear. The paradox exposes something deep about how we think and speak. Our brains like to group things into categories: heap or not a heap, tall or short, old or young. But real life is full of grey areas. The Sorites Paradox reminds us that the world doesn't always fit neatly into the boxes we try to put it in. This becomes especially important in areas like law, ethics, or politics. Think about laws that punish speeding. If the speed limit is 60 miles per hour, what happens if you drive at 61? Technically, you're speeding, but it feels like such a small difference. Now, what about 62 or 63? It's hard to draw a firm line between what counts as safe and what counts as dangerous. But laws have to draw that line somewhere, even if it feels a little unfair. The Sorites Paradox also shows up in everyday life when we think about change. Often, we don't notice the small shifts happening around us or within us. A little stress here, a tiny habit there. One skipped workout, one extra cookie. On their own, they feel harmless, but over time, they add up. Big changes are made of tiny steps, and this paradox helps us see how powerful and sneaky those steps can be. So, how do we deal with this paradox? Some philosophers have tried to solve it by saying vague words like heap or bald are just fuzzy by nature, and we need to accept that. Others have tried to build logic systems that can handle vagueness better, but many agree that part of the beauty of the Sorites Paradox is that it doesn't have a clear solution. It's a reminder that language is flexible, reality is messy, and not every question has a sharp answer. In the end, the Sorites Paradox isn't just about grains of sand. It's about the way we think about change, identity, and how we draw the lines that shape our world. It encourages us to be more aware of the gradual shifts in life and to question the categories we use without even thinking. It may not give us easy answers, but it definitely makes us think, and that's exactly what a good paradox is meant to do. The Friendship Paradox. It suggests that, on average, most people's friends have more friends than they do. At first glance, this might sound like a statistical trick or a strange quirk of numbers, but it reveals deeper insights into how our social networks are structured and how we perceive ourselves. When we look at our social circles, it often feels like we are just one part of a vast web of connections. We meet people through school, work, or social events, and each of those individuals has their own group of friends. Statistically, the more connected someone is, the more likely they are to appear in many people's friend lists. This means that, on average, your friends tend to be more popular than you are. It is not necessarily a comment on your personal worth. Instead, it reflects a mathematical reality of network connections. This paradox arises because people who have many friends are overrepresented when you sample friends from the entire population. If a person has a large circle, they are likely to be a friend to many, so their high number of connections skews the average upward. In contrast, people with fewer friends are less likely to be noticed in the overall network. As a result, even if you have a modest number of friends, the average number of friends that your friends have is often higher than your own count. This phenomenon can sometimes lead people to feel as though they are less popular than they actually are, when in fact, it is simply the way social networks work. This paradox has interesting implications for how we view ourselves in relation to others. In a world dominated by social media, where numbers like followers and friends are constantly visible, it is easy to fall into the trap of comparing ourselves to others. When you see that most of your friends have hundreds or even thousands of connections, it might seem like you are not measuring up. However, the friendship paradox teaches us that such comparisons can be misleading. It is not an accurate reflection of personal value or social worth. It is just a mathematical artifact of how networks are structured. Moreover, the paradox encourages us to think about the role of influential individuals in society. People with a large number of connections often serve as hubs in social networks. They can influence opinions, spread information quickly, and shape trends in ways that less connected individuals cannot. This means that the dynamics of popularity and influence are deeply intertwined with the structure of our relationships. The friendship paradox is one way to observe this phenomenon in action, highlighting that the most connected individuals have a disproportionate impact on how social information flows. Another interesting aspect of the friendship paradox is how it can lead to changes in behavior. Knowing that your friends tend to be more connected might motivate you to expand your own social circle or engage more actively with your community. Alternatively, it might encourage reflection on what true friendship means beyond the numbers. Instead of focusing solely on how many people you know, you might consider the quality of those relationships. The paradox invites us to think about the difference between quantity and quality in our social lives. In the end, the friendship paradox is not a critique of anyone's social skills or a reason to feel inadequate. It is simply a fascinating observation about the nature of social networks and the way connections are distributed among people. By understanding this paradox, we can better appreciate that our perceptions of popularity are often influenced by statistical effects that are out of our control. It reminds us that every person, regardless of the number of friends they have, contributes uniquely to the social fabric. The true value of friendship lies not in numbers, but in the genuine connections that enrich our lives. The paradox challenges us to look beyond simple counts and to appreciate the complexity of our social world. It shows that sometimes the most intriguing truths about human relationships can be uncovered through careful observation and a little bit of math. In this way, the friendship paradox not only deepens our understanding of networks, but also invites us to reflect on what it truly means to be connected in a modern world. Prisoner's dilemma. Two people are arrested for a crime. They're put in separate rooms with no way to talk to each other. Each one is offered a deal. If you confess and your partner stays silent, you'll go free and your partner gets 10 years in prison. But if you both confess, you each get 5 years. If neither of you talks, you both get only 1 year for a minor charge. What should you do? This is the famous prisoner's dilemma. It's not just a puzzle for criminals, it's one of the most powerful and widely studied ideas in game theory, economics, politics, and even everyday life. At its heart, it's about trust, cooperation, and the tricky balance between looking out for yourself and working with others. On the surface, it seems like you should stay quiet. If your partner also stays quiet, you both get a light sentence, just 1 year. But here's where the dilemma kicks in. If your partner betrays you and you stay silent, you get 10 years while they walk free. That's the worst outcome for you. So maybe you should confess, just to protect yourself. But your partner is thinking the exact same thing. They also don't want to risk being the only one who stays silent while the other confesses. So both of you end up confessing. And instead of the best possible outcome, just 1 year each, You both get 5. It's not the worst result, but it's clearly not the best either. This shows how two people, both making logical choices to protect themselves, can end up with a worse result than if they had trusted each other. The real power of the prisoner's dilemma is how it applies to everyday life. It pops up in business when companies choose whether to compete aggressively or cooperate. It happens in relationships where trust can make or break communication. It even shows up in environmental issues. Imagine two countries deciding whether to reduce pollution. If both do their part, the planet benefits. But if one holds back while the other takes action, the non-participant gets the benefits without paying the price. So both might decide not to act, and everyone loses. One of the key lessons from the prisoner's dilemma is that what seems best for the individual can be bad for the group. It highlights the tension between selfishness and cooperation. If everyone acts only for their own gain, everyone may end up worse off. But cooperation requires trust, and trust is risky because there's always the chance the other person will let you down. The dilemma becomes even more interesting when repeated over time. If two people, or two countries, or two businesses face the same choice over and over, they can learn from each other's behavior. Trust can be built, broken, and sometimes repaired. Strategies like tit for tat, where you start by cooperating and then copy what the other person did last time, can help promote fairness and discourage betrayal. This turns the prisoner's dilemma into a lesson not just in strategy, but in relationships and reputation. There's something very human about the paradox. We've all faced situations where we have to decide whether to look out for ourselves or work with someone else, not knowing if they'll do the same. It's a problem of limited knowledge and limited trust, and it's not always easy to know what the right move is. The prisoner's dilemma doesn't give easy answers, but it opens our eyes to the forces that shape our decisions. It shows how difficult cooperation can be, even when it's clearly the best choice. And it reminds us that logic and self-interest don't always lead to the best outcomes. Sometimes, what's smart in the short term can be costly in the long run. In a world where we rely on each other every day, in families, in communities, in nations, the prisoner's dilemma is more than just a game. It's a mirror reflecting the challenge of living together, balancing trust and fear, and choosing whether to protect ourselves or take the risk of working together. Raven Paradox. Let's say someone tells you all ravens are black. It sounds like a simple, harmless statement. Now, you want to test if this claim is true, so you go outside and start looking for ravens. You see one perched on a fence, and sure enough, it's black. That supports the statement. Then you see another, also black. So far, so good. But now, here's where things get strange. According to logic, seeing something that's not a raven and not black, like a green apple, also counts as evidence that all ravens are black. Wait, what? How can a green apple tell you anything about the color of ravens? This strange and surprising idea is at the heart of the Raven Paradox. It was introduced by a philosopher named Carl Hempel in the 20th century. The paradox shows how reasoning and evidence don't always work the way we expect them to. On the surface, it seems obvious that if you want to prove all ravens are black, you should only be looking at ravens. But logic has its own rules, and those rules sometimes lead to very odd conclusions. Let's break it down a bit. The original statement, all ravens are black, is what's called a universal statement. It means that for every object in the world, if it's a raven, then it must be black. So, logically, this is the same as saying, if something is not black, then it is not a raven. That sounds like a completely different sentence, But in formal logic, these two are actually equivalent. They mean the same thing in terms of truth. So, if you find a green apple, which is not black and not a raven, that's technically supporting the second version of the statement. And because the two statements are logically equal, the green apple ends up supporting the original claim too. This is where the mind starts to twist. It feels wrong, doesn't it? Why should a green apple say anything about ravens at all? It's not related. But logic doesn't care how things feel. It follows its own path. According to strict rules of reasoning, every time you observe a non-black non-raven, you are indirectly supporting the statement that all ravens are black. That's the paradox. It pits our common sense against the cold structure of formal logic. Now, most people don't go around collecting apples to prove facts about birds. So why does this paradox matter? Because it points to a deeper problem about how we understand evidence. In science, in daily life, in detective stories, we often collect examples to confirm what we believe. But the Raven Paradox reminds us that not all evidence is equally meaningful, even if logic says it counts. 1,000 black ravens feel like strong proof that all ravens are black. But 1,000 green apples, that feels like noise, not help. Philosophers and scientists have debated how to resolve this paradox. Some suggest that while non-black non-ravens do count as evidence, they're very weak evidence compared to seeing actual black ravens. Others say the paradox shows a limitation in the way we connect ideas through logic. And still others argue that it reveals how our thinking is shaped not just by logic, but by context, experience, and intuition. What makes the Raven Paradox so fascinating is that it takes something small and turns it into a giant question about how we know what we know. It shows that truth and evidence aren't always as straightforward as we wish they were. It challenges the way we collect knowledge, the trust we put in examples, and the strange tricks that reasoning can play on us. So the next time someone makes a big claim and starts pointing to examples to back it up, think of the raven and the apple. Because sometimes what seems like perfect logic can leave us with more questions than answers. And that's exactly why paradoxes like this are so powerful. They don't just teach us facts, they teach us how to think. The lottery paradox. You just bought a ticket for a lottery, and the odds of winning are extremely low. In fact, there's only one winner among millions of tickets. You know that the chance of winning is so small that it's almost impossible, but you still buy the ticket and hope for the best. Now, let's say you look at the results of the lottery draw. The numbers are announced, and it's clear that someone has won, but you didn't win. In fact, there are millions of other people who didn't win either. Everyone who didn't win can logically say, "I didn't win." But here's where the paradox comes in. Each person who didn't win, including you, can also make a reasonable statement. I know I didn't win, but someone did. You might even say, I know that there is a winner out there, even though it's not me. This seems perfectly rational. After all, we all know that lotteries have winners. But the paradox arises when we ask a deeper question. Can you really believe the statement, someone will win, before the lottery results are known? Here's the issue. You know that the odds are against you, and based on those odds, you can reasonably believe that you won't win. But because lotteries are random, you can't rule out the possibility of winning entirely. There's always a chance, no matter how small. This is where the paradox becomes tricky. While you can make a rational prediction about not winning, you also know that it's possible for you to be the one who does win. In this sense, your belief in the outcome of the lottery is both rational and irrational at the same time. On the one hand, it's perfectly reasonable to believe that you won't win. The probability is against you, and based on those odds, it seems unlikely. But on the other hand, it's also rational to believe that someone will win, and therefore it's possible that you could be that winner. This leads to the paradox. How can you hold both of these beliefs at the same time? The lottery paradox brings to light something important about how we think about probability and belief. When faced with uncertain events, like a lottery, we often make predictions based on the odds. These predictions help us manage our expectations and prepare for the outcome. But even though we may have a rational belief that we won't win, we also know that winning is still a possibility. So, how do we reconcile these two beliefs? This paradox can be understood in terms of what philosophers call epistemic uncertainty, the idea that our knowledge of events is limited by probability. In situations like a lottery, we may know the odds and can make predictions based on that knowledge, but we can never be certain of the outcome until it actually happens. So, while we might say, "I know I didn't win," we also can't rule out the possibility that we could have won, even though the odds are stacked against us. The paradox makes us realize that our beliefs about uncertain events are not always as clear-cut as we might think. One of the interesting implications of the lottery paradox is that it challenges our ideas about what it means to know something. In everyday life, we think that knowledge is about being certain. If you know something, you are certain about it. But in the context of probability, we realize that knowing something doesn't always mean having complete certainty. For example, when you say, "I know I didn't win the lottery," you're basing your knowledge on probability, not certainty. Yet this belief is still rational, even though it might not be completely accurate. After all, it's always possible to win, no matter how small the chance. The paradox also sheds light on the role of probability in decision-making. When we make decisions based on probability, we are acknowledging uncertainty. Even though we might believe something is highly unlikely, we can't rule out the possibility that it will happen. This is why people still play the lottery, despite knowing the odds are against them. It's because, even if the chance is slim, there's still a small chance of winning, and that's enough to spark hope and excitement. The lottery paradox forces us to confront the limits of our knowledge and the way we understand uncertainty. It shows that our beliefs are often shaped by probabilities, but that doesn't mean they are always certain. The paradox also makes us think about how we balance rational predictions with the possibility of surprise outcomes. In a world filled with uncertainty, sometimes the most logical belief might still leave room for the unexpected. And perhaps that's what makes the lottery so fascinating, because no matter how small the odds, there's always a chance that someone, somewhere, will win. The Pinocchio Paradox. Pinocchio is a wooden puppet whose nose grows whenever he tells a lie. Now, Pinocchio says, "My nose will grow now." This statement creates a tricky situation. If it is true, then his nose should grow. But if his nose grows, it means he lied, which would mean his statement was false. On the other hand, if his statement is false and his nose does not grow, then he must have been telling the truth. Either way, the statement causes a contradiction that leaves us stuck with no clear answer. The paradox begins when we try to decide whether Pinocchio's statement is true or false. If we assume the statement is true, then his nose grows. But the rule is that his nose only grows when he lies. Therefore, if his nose grows, that means he did not tell the truth. Yet, if he did not tell the truth, then the statement is false. Now, if we assume his statement is false, his nose should not grow. However, if his nose doesn't grow, then he must be telling the truth about it not growing. This back and forth loop creates the heart of the paradox. Pinocchio's statement cannot be neatly classified as true or false without running into a contradiction. This puzzling situation is an example of a self-referential paradox, similar to the famous liar paradox. In the liar paradox, a sentence like, "This statement is false," creates an endless loop of contradiction. The Pinocchio paradox works in much the same way because Pinocchio's claim about his nose refers back to itself. It becomes impossible to decide whether the statement is accurate because its truth value continuously undermines itself. The Pinocchio paradox forces us to think about the nature of truth. In everyday life, we usually assume that statements are either true or false. Yet, when a statement refers to itself, as in Pinocchio's case, the line between truth and falsehood becomes blurred. This situation challenges the common belief that our language always provides clear answers. Instead, it shows that sometimes the structure of a statement can make it impossible to settle on a single truth value. Another interesting aspect of the paradox is how it makes us reconsider the consequences of lying. In Pinocchio's world, lying has a very visible, physical outcome. His nose grows. This clear consequence is meant to deter him from dishonesty. However, when Pinocchio makes a statement about his nose growing, the consequence itself becomes the source of the contradiction. The paradox, therefore, highlights how rules or consequences that work well in one situation may become problematic when they are applied to self-referential statements. The Pinocchio paradox is not just a playful riddle. It has deeper implications for logic and philosophy. It invites us to explore the limits of our reasoning and to question whether our standard definitions of truth and falsehood are adequate in every situation. Philosophers and logicians have long studied such paradoxes to better understand the foundations of language and thought. They show us that even simple systems can become incredibly complex when self-reference is introduced. In the end, the Pinocchio paradox reminds us that some questions have no straightforward answers. It challenges the idea that our everyday logic can explain every scenario without contradiction. While it might seem like a mere toy problem based on a children's story, the paradox has significant implications for how we understand communication and truth in more complex systems. It is a clear example of how our language and the rules we follow can sometimes lead us into puzzling territory. The paradox does not have a neat resolution, and that is part of its allure. It pushes us to recognize that the world of logic is full of surprises, and that sometimes even the simplest statements can hide deep complexities. The Pinocchio paradox is a playful yet profound reminder that truth, lies, and the consequences they bring are not always as clear-cut as they seem. The Bootstrap Paradox. This paradox involves a situation where something exists without a clear origin, creating a loop where cause and effect feed into each other. Imagine this scenario. Someone from the future travels back in time and gives their younger self a book that contains instructions on how to build a time machine. The paradox arises because the book exists in the present, but its creation seems to have no true origin. It exists because the future self gave it to the past self. But how can the book exist if no one truly created it? This paradox gets its name from the idea of pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps, which refers to doing something seemingly impossible. In this case, an object or information exists in a loop, where it is both the cause and the effect. The book is bootstrapped into existence because the future person gave it to their younger self. But for this to happen, the book must already exist. This circular cause and effect relationship makes it difficult to determine where the object or information originally came from. The Bootstrap Paradox questions our understanding of causality. In most of our daily lives, we see cause and effect as a straightforward process. If you drop a ball, it will fall because gravity pulls it down. We assume that events occur in a linear fashion. One event causes another, and so on. But in the Bootstrap Paradox, the usual rules of cause and effect don't apply. Instead of a clear origin for the object or information, we are left with a loop where the cause and effect are indistinguishable. This raises the question, can something exist without ever being created? And if so, what does that mean for our understanding of reality? To understand the paradox better, let's consider another example. The Mona Lisa. Imagine a time traveler goes back in time and shows Leonardo da Vinci a picture of the famous painting. Inspired by the image, da Vinci then paints the Mona Lisa. The time traveler only has the Mona Lisa because da Vinci painted it. But who created the idea for the painting? It seems that the painting is caught in a loop where it is both the cause and the effect. The Mona Lisa exists, but there is no true origin for it. It exists because it was given to da Vinci by the time traveler, who only had it because da Vinci had painted it. This paradox also makes us think about time itself. Normally, we think of time as moving in one direction, from the past to the present and into the future. But the Bootstrap Paradox suggests that time might not be as straightforward as we believe. It creates a scenario where events loop back on themselves, and the usual flow of time is disrupted. If something exists without an origin, can we really trust our understanding of time and causality? The Bootstrap Paradox has intrigued philosophers, scientists, and thinkers for a long time because it challenges our assumptions about the nature of time and reality. If time travel were possible, it could create situations where objects and information exist without ever having been created. Yet, this idea raises the question of whether such time travel could even be possible. Could the paradox be a flaw in our understanding of the universe, or does it simply point to something we haven't yet figured out? While the Bootstrap Paradox doesn't have a simple answer, it's a valuable thought experiment that pushes us to think more deeply about time and reality. It makes us question whether our assumptions about cause and effect are valid, and whether time is as simple as we assume. This paradox shows us that sometimes things might exist in ways that don't fit into our typical understanding of how the world works. In the end, the Bootstrap Paradox reminds us that reality may be more complicated than we think. Time and causality might not follow a simple, linear path. The paradox forces us to confront the possibility that objects, information, and even time itself could exist in loops that defy conventional logic. While we may never fully resolve the paradox, it serves as a fascinating exploration of the mysteries of time and the limits of our understanding of the world. The paradox of choice. It explores an interesting and somewhat counterintuitive idea. More choices can sometimes make us feel less satisfied. It seems like a simple concept. More options should lead to better decisions, right? But in reality, the opposite can happen. The more choices we have, the more overwhelmed we can feel, and the less likely we are to be happy with the decisions we eventually make. Think about a time when you walked into a store to buy a product, like a bottle of shampoo. You might have been faced with dozens or even hundreds of different options. Each bottle promises something a little different: more volume, shinier hair, better for sensitive skin, and so on. Initially, having so many options might sound great. It gives you the sense of control and freedom, like you can find the perfect choice for your needs. But when you actually have to make a decision, the overwhelming number of choices can leave you feeling uncertain. What if you pick the wrong one? What if another bottle would have worked better for you? This feeling of doubt can often lead to dissatisfaction with your choice, even after you've made it. This is a direct result of the choice paradox. It suggests that when we're faced with too many options, our minds become bogged down with possibilities. Instead of feeling empowered by the freedom of choice, we feel paralyzed and anxious. We start to worry about making the perfect choice, and in doing so, we sometimes end up making no choice at all, or a decision that we later regret. The problem also lies in the fact that the more choices we have, the higher our expectations become. If we have a limited number of options, we might settle for the best one available and feel content with it. However, when faced with many options, our expectations climb. We start thinking that there must be an ideal option out there, something better than what we initially picked, and this search for perfection can make us unhappy with what we eventually choose. The choice paradox is not just limited to consumer products like shampoo or clothes. It shows up in many aspects of our lives. Consider choosing a career path. The world today offers an overwhelming number of options for jobs and careers. This abundance of choices should make us feel free, but it often has the opposite effect. The fear of making the wrong choice, of missing out on the perfect job or career, can cause stress and anxiety. People may even delay making decisions together, waiting for the ideal opportunity that might never come. This paradox is also seen in the digital world. The internet is full of endless information and choices. We can watch an infinite number of movies, read countless books, and visit thousands of websites. While this can be exciting at first, it often leads to feelings of being lost in a sea of options. The paradox comes into play when we realize that having too many choices doesn't always lead to happiness or fulfillment. Instead of enjoying the process of discovery, we spend time worrying if we're missing out on something better. Interestingly, research has shown that people often feel happier with fewer choices. Studies have demonstrated that when people are given just a small number of options, they tend to make quicker decisions and feel more satisfied with their choices. This is called satisficing, a term used to describe making a decision that is good enough rather than obsessing over finding the absolute best option. When we limit our options, we can focus on the decision itself and feel more confident in what we choose. Of course, the key here is balance. While having choices is essential for freedom and autonomy, too many choices can lead to the feeling that no decision is ever quite good enough. The choice paradox shows us that sometimes less is more. If we can accept that there will never be a perfect option and learn to be satisfied with a good enough choice, we might find ourselves more content with the decisions we make. In conclusion, the choice paradox reminds us that having more options doesn't always lead to more happiness. The overwhelming number of choices available today can lead to confusion, stress, and dissatisfaction. While choices are important, it's also essential to recognize when too many options are hindering our ability to make a decision. By understanding the paradox, we can learn to navigate choices with less anxiety and more confidence, ultimately finding peace in the idea that sometimes good enough is truly enough. The value paradox is a fascinating idea that challenges how we understand worth and importance. It shows that something can seem valuable in one context but lose that value in another. Sometimes, things we consider priceless turn out to be less useful than things we take for granted. This paradox doesn't just apply to money or objects. It also affects how we judge people, time, experiences, and even emotions. At its core, the value paradox reminds us that value isn't fixed. It shifts based on perspective, context, and need. Take water and gold, for example. Gold is expensive, shiny, and rare. People invest in it, wear it, and guard it. Water, on the other hand, is everywhere. You can drink it, wash with it, and use it daily without thinking much. But imagine being stranded in a desert. Suddenly, a bottle of water becomes far more valuable than a bar of gold. At that moment, gold can't save your life, but water can. This is the classic example used to explain the paradox. It reveals how value depends not just on the object itself, but on the situation we're in. Another place where the value paradox shows up is in how we treat time. People often say, time is money, but in practice, we waste time far more casually than we waste cash. Hours scroll by on phones, lost in apps and videos, while we try to save a few dollars here and there. Yet time is something we can never get back. The paradox here is that we often treat the most limited and precious resource we have as if it were unlimited, while guarding money, which we can earn again. This also plays out in our relationships. Sometimes people don't truly value their friends, family, or partners until they lose them or face a major life change. The things we assume will always be there, like someone's presence, support, or love, can fade or disappear, and only then do we realize how priceless they were. The paradox is that we sometimes only understand the value of something after it's gone. In the moment, we might overlook it or take it for granted because it feels familiar or ordinary. Even in economics, the value paradox appears. Something that's expensive doesn't always provide more satisfaction or utility than something cheap. A simple, affordable meal might bring more joy than a fancy one. A well-worn pair of shoes could feel better than a high-priced brand-new pair. This is why marketers often try to create value through packaging, branding, and storytelling, rather than relying solely on actual usefulness. What we value is shaped not just by need, but by emotion, culture, and presentation. The paradox also asks us to question our priorities. We spend years chasing things we think are valuable, like money, status, or possessions, only to find out that what really matters are things that often can't be bought, like peace of mind, good health, meaningful relationships, or self-respect. These things don't always come with a price tag, but they are deeply valuable. Yet in daily life, they can be overlooked while we chase things that seem shinier or more urgent. The value paradox invites us to step back and think about what we truly care about. What matters most to us when we're calm and honest with ourselves? What do we miss when it's gone? What are we trading away in the name of progress, success, or popularity? These aren't always easy questions to answer, but they're important. In the end, the value paradox reminds us that worth isn't always about price or popularity. Sometimes the most valuable things in life are invisible, quiet, or ordinary. And while it's fine to enjoy nice things and seek success, it's also wise to pause and consider what really holds meaning. Recognizing the difference between what looks valuable and what truly is valuable might just change how we live. The thrift paradox. Most people are taught that saving money is always a good thing. Being thrifty, spending less, saving more, avoiding waste, sounds like the smart and responsible path. And, on an individual level, it usually is. If one person saves money, they're better prepared for the future, emergencies, or unexpected expenses. But the paradox appears when everyone starts doing the same thing. If every person, every household, and every business suddenly decides to save more and spend less at the same time, something unexpected happens. The economy can actually suffer. It sounds strange, right? How can saving money hurt anyone? To understand this, think about how money moves. When you spend money on groceries, clothes, services, or entertainment, You're not just getting what you need, you're also supporting the people who work in those businesses. The grocery store pays its workers. The clothing shop places new orders with its suppliers. The restaurant hires cooks and servers. When people spend money, it keeps others employed and keeps the economy flowing. Now, imagine everyone decides to cut back and save more. Fewer people go out to eat, fewer buy clothes, fewer take trips. At first, this might seem like a smart and cautious move, but soon businesses start earning less. Some may reduce their staff, others may close altogether. Jobs get cut, people have less money, and so they spend even less. This causes a cycle where more saving leads to more job loss, and more job loss leads to more saving out of fear, and the economy slows down even further. This is the heart of the thrift paradox. It's a bit like a group of people sitting in a stadium. One person stands up to get a better view. It works for them. But if everyone stands up, no one can see better, and now everyone is just more uncomfortable. What helps one person doesn't always help everyone if everyone does it at once. Thrift works the same way. One person's savings is smart, but when an entire society pulls back, it can create unintended harm. Economists often talk about this paradox during hard times, like recessions. During economic downturns, people naturally become more cautious. They cut back spending to protect themselves, which makes sense. But if everyone does it, recovery becomes harder. That's why, in tough times, governments often encourage spending. They may lower interest rates, send out stimulus checks, or start public projects to keep money moving. The goal is to balance caution with momentum, because without spending, growth slows and more people suffer. None of this means saving money is bad. Being financially careful is still wise, especially for individuals and families. But the thrift paradox reminds us that economies rely on people spending money too. A healthy economy is a balance of both saving and spending. If the scale tips too far in one direction, problems arise. There's also a deeper idea here about how we're all connected. One person's spending is another person's income. The money you use to buy a haircut helps the barber pay rent and buy food. The money you spend on local businesses supports your community. So while thrift may feel like a private choice, it has public effects. The thrift paradox teaches us that good intentions can sometimes lead to bad outcomes when applied at scale. It shows how individual choices, even smart ones, can combine into something harmful if they all go the same direction at once. It also reminds us to think bigger than just our own wallets. Our choices echo through the world around us. In the end, thrift is valuable, but it must be balanced with generosity, investment, and participation. An economy, just like a community, thrives when there's movement, trust, and shared effort. The challenge is knowing when to save and when to spend, not just for ourselves, but for the good of all. Tolerance Paradox. Let's say there is a world where everyone is treated equally, where people live in harmony, and where respect for each other's differences is the rule, not the exception. This world sounds ideal, right? But there's a catch. The concept of tolerance, which is central to this peaceful society, comes with a paradox that challenges the very idea of creating a world where everyone is accepted. The tolerance paradox begins when you think about what tolerance really means. To tolerate something is to allow or accept something you might not necessarily agree with, something that might be different from your own beliefs or values. The idea is that we should accept others' differences, even when they don't align with our own views. In an ideal society, tolerance helps people coexist despite having different opinions, cultures, or ways of life. It encourages understanding, acceptance, and peaceful coexistence. But here's the problem. Tolerance, when pushed to its limits, can sometimes end up supporting the very thing it seeks to fight. For example, if a society is tolerant of everything, every belief, every ideology, no matter how harmful or discriminatory it may be, then it could end up tolerating intolerance itself. In this case, a group that promotes intolerance might gain a platform and the freedom to express its harmful ideas. And because tolerance is often defined as allowing people to express their views freely, even hateful or extreme beliefs are tolerated. This creates a tricky situation. Let's take an example. Imagine there's a political group in a country that believes in suppressing the rights of certain people, like a group that wants to limit the freedoms of a particular race, gender, or religion. If society is overly tolerant, this group might be allowed to speak out, organize, and spread their message of intolerance. The irony is that by tolerating this intolerant group, society may inadvertently be creating conditions where tolerance itself is destroyed. The very act of allowing intolerant groups to exist could end up undermining the principles of acceptance and equality that tolerance is supposed to promote. The tolerance paradox highlights this uncomfortable dilemma. If we accept everything, even ideas that undermine the values of equality and freedom, we risk losing the very foundation of a tolerant society. On the other hand, if we refuse to tolerate those who are intolerant, we might seem to be contradicting our own values. After all, isn't tolerance about accepting people's differences, even when those differences might be harmful to others? So, what can be done to resolve the tolerance paradox? Philosophers and thinkers have struggled with this question for a long time, and the debate continues today. One possible solution is the idea of limited tolerance. This concept suggests that while it's important to tolerate most beliefs and ideas, there should be limits when those beliefs pose a threat to the core values of society, like freedom, equality, and respect for others. In other words, it's not necessary to tolerate intolerance. A society that values freedom and equality may need to draw the line at certain ideas or behaviors that go against those values. Another approach is to focus on promoting the values of tolerance in a way that encourages respectful dialogue and understanding. Rather than simply tolerating any and all ideas, a society can actively foster an environment where people are encouraged to engage with each other in a constructive and respectful manner. This approach is about more than just accepting differences. It's about creating an atmosphere where people actively seek to understand one another, even if they don't agree. Despite these potential solutions, the tolerance paradox remains a challenge. It forces us to confront the limits of our values and how far we should go to protect them. It also makes us think about the delicate balance between freedom of expression and the need to protect vulnerable groups from harm. Should society accept extreme or harmful views in the name of tolerance, or should there be a line drawn to prevent the spread of ideas that threaten the principles of equality and respect? In the end, the tolerance paradox isn't just about a theoretical puzzle. It's a real-world challenge that affects how we interact with others in society. It forces us to think about how we can live in a diverse world where people hold differing opinions without compromising the fundamental values that make us all equal and free. The paradox doesn't have a simple solution, but it encourages us to constantly reflect on what it truly means to be tolerant and whether there are limits to that tolerance. It reminds us that tolerance, while important, needs to be practiced thoughtfully, carefully, and with an awareness of its potential consequences. The hedonism paradox. Most people want to be happy. That's natural. We work hard, plan our futures, make choices, all hoping to feel good, enjoy life, and avoid pain. Hedonism is a philosophy that says pleasure and happiness are the highest goals in life. But here's where the paradox steps in. The more you chase happiness directly, the harder it becomes to find it. This might sound strange. If you want to be happy, shouldn't you focus on doing things that make you happy? Like eating your favorite food, buying something nice, watching your favorite show, or going on vacation. These things do bring pleasure. But when you focus too much on trying to feel good all the time, something unexpected often happens. You start feeling empty, unsatisfied, or even more anxious than before. The paradox works like this. When happiness becomes your main goal, it starts slipping away. You become so focused on feeling good that you start measuring everything. Was this fun enough? Did I enjoy that enough? Could I have done something better? These questions can creep into your mind and ruin the moment. You stop living in the experience and start judging it. And as a result, the happiness you were hoping for feels out of reach. This happens in real life more than we might think. People often chase after pleasure, going to parties, buying new things, trying to stay constantly entertained, thinking this will lead to a joyful life. But after a while, these things stop feeling special. The excitement fades. What once brought joy now feels normal or even boring. This is called hedonic adaptation. Our minds get used to pleasure, and we need more and more to feel the same effect. But no matter how much you chase, the satisfaction doesn't last. On the other hand, think about times when you weren't trying to be happy, but happiness found you anyway. Maybe you were helping someone, working hard on a meaningful project, or spending quiet time with a friend. You weren't chasing joy. You were simply doing something you cared about. And yet, happiness showed up naturally. That's the surprising truth the hedonism paradox points to. When you stop focusing on happiness and start focusing on purpose, connection, or growth, happiness often follows as a side effect. Philosophers, psychologists, and writers have all noticed this pattern. Viktor Frankl, a psychologist and Holocaust survivor, once wrote that happiness cannot be pursued, it must ensue. In other words, happiness isn't something you grab. It's something that comes to you when you're focused on something else, something bigger than yourself. This doesn't mean you should ignore fun or pleasure. Enjoying life is important, but when pleasure becomes the only goal, it can turn into a trap. You may end up feeling more lost, more anxious, or always searching for the next best thing. That constant chase can make the present moment feel like it's never enough. The hedonism paradox teaches us something deeply valuable. Lasting happiness comes from living well, not from trying to feel good all the time. It grows from things like love, purpose, kindness, curiosity, and creativity. These things don't always bring instant pleasure. Sometimes they're hard or uncomfortable, but they have deeper roots. They create a sense of meaning that lasts much longer than a temporary thrill. In the end, this paradox is a quiet reminder. It tells us not to be fooled by the quick fix or the shiny promise of constant joy. Real happiness is not something we find by chasing it directly. It comes when we live with intention, care about others, and engage with life in honest, meaningful ways. When we stop asking, "Am I happy right now?" and start asking, "What truly matters to me?" we just might discover that happiness has been quietly waiting all along. Schrödinger's cat paradox. It begins with a thought experiment. A cat is placed inside a sealed box with a radioactive atom, a Geiger counter, and a vial of poison. The setup is designed so that, if the atom decays, the counter will trigger the release of poison, which will kill the cat. If the atom doesn't decay, the cat remains alive. However, according to the strange rules of quantum mechanics, until the box is opened and an observation is made, the cat is in a state of being both alive and dead at the same time. This paradox was created by physicist Erwin Schrödinger in 1935 to highlight the bizarre nature of quantum mechanics. At the time, scientists were grappling with the strange behavior of subatomic particles. Quantum mechanics showed that particles, such as electrons, can exist in multiple states at once, a concept known as superposition. Schrödinger's thought experiment extended this idea to a macroscopic object, like a cat, to illustrate how counterintuitive quantum mechanics can be. In the world of quantum mechanics, particles don't exist in just one state until they are observed. Instead, they exist in a superposition of all possible states. So, before the box is opened, the atom inside is both decayed and not decayed. This means that according to quantum theory, the cat is simultaneously alive and dead. It is only when someone opens the box to check that the superposition collapses and the cat's state becomes definite, alive or dead. This paradox brings up a fundamental question about reality itself. In our everyday experience, objects are not both one thing and another. A cat is either alive or dead, not both. Yet quantum mechanics suggests that, at the microscopic level, things can exist in a state of multiple possibilities. This creates a dilemma. If particles can be in two states at once, why don't we see this in the world around us? Why is it that when we look at something, it seems to decide on one state? The Schrödinger's cat paradox challenges our common sense understanding of how the world works. It shows that, on a quantum level, particles do not behave the way we expect them to. Instead of being in one place or one state, particles exist in a range of possibilities, and it's only through observation that the system collapses into one definite state. The paradox also raises important questions about the role of the observer in quantum mechanics. According to some interpretations of quantum theory, the act of observation is what forces the system to choose a specific state. This has led to some fascinating debates. Does reality only exist when we observe it? If we didn't look inside the box, would the cat remain in a superposition of life and death? This line of thinking has led to theories about the role of consciousness in shaping the physical world. Although Schrödinger's cat is just a thought experiment, it has had a lasting impact on how we think about quantum mechanics. It makes clear how different the quantum world is from our everyday experiences. The paradox also shows that the strange behavior of particles doesn't scale up to the macroscopic world. A cat can't actually be both alive and dead at the same time because the effects of quantum mechanics don't manifest on such a large scale. In reality, the cat is either alive or dead long before we observe it because the quantum effects average out. However, the Schrödinger's cat paradox isn't just an interesting puzzle, it's a reflection of the limits of our understanding. It forces us to confront the mysteries of the universe and reminds us that the rules we experience in our daily lives don't always apply on the microscopic level. The paradox also demonstrates how quantum mechanics pushes us to think differently about the nature of reality. In the quantum world, particles exist in probabilities and possibilities, not certainties. In the end, Schrödinger's cat paradox doesn't mean that cats can really be both alive and dead at the same time. Instead, it's a way of showing how quantum mechanics works in a way that seems completely unnatural to us. The paradox is a reminder that the universe, especially on a small scale, doesn't always follow the rules we expect. It invites us to rethink how we understand reality, and what it means for something to truly exist. The paradox may never have a clear, straightforward answer, but it has certainly expanded our understanding of the strange, fascinating world of quantum mechanics. Crocodile Paradox. You're standing near a river. A crocodile has taken your child. It turns towards you and speaks, not with a roar or a hiss, but with chilling logic. It says, "I will return your child if and only if you correctly guess what I will do next." It's not just a strange moment. It's a trap built from pure logic. What you say next might decide everything, but the more you think about it, the less sense it makes. This is the heart of the crocodile paradox, a classic puzzle that pulls reason in two directions at once. Let's break down the situation. You have one chance to respond to the crocodile and two basic guesses to choose from. Either you guess that the crocodile will return your child, or you guess that it won't. Each guess creates a very different kind of problem. Suppose you say, "You will return my child." If the crocodile had already planned to return the child, then your guess is correct, and it gives the child back. Everything checks out. But if the crocodile wasn't planning to return the child, then your guess is wrong, and it doesn't have to give the child back. In this case, the situation stays consistent. There's no paradox here yet. But now let's try the second guess. You say, "You will not return my child." This is where things fall apart. If the crocodile truly planned to keep the child, then your guess is correct. But because you guessed correctly, the crocodile is supposed to return the child. That creates a contradiction. It must return the child because you guessed correctly, but it was only correct because it wasn't going to return the child. It can't do both. On the other hand, if the crocodile planned to return the child, then your prediction is incorrect. So it shouldn't return the child. But it was planning to return the child in the first place. Once again, nothing lines up. The logic loops in circles, creating a situation where no outcome satisfies the condition. That's the paradox. At its core, this is a problem of self-reference. The crocodile's promise depends entirely on your guess, and your guess depends entirely on what the crocodile plans to do. Each side is locked into the other like two gears that can't turn without braking. It's a bit like the liar paradox, where someone says, "This sentence is false. If it's true, then it's false. If it's false, then it's true." The crocodile paradox does the same thing, but with real stakes and emotional weight. It also raises questions about promises and conditions. When someone makes a promise, we assume it can be either kept or broken. But what happens when the promise itself creates a condition that makes keeping it impossible? Is it still a promise, or is it a trick disguised as one? The crocodile offers a deal that seems fair on the surface, but as soon as you engage with it, the rules break themselves. This puzzle also says something deeper about trust and power. The crocodile holds all the control in this moment. It sets the terms, asks the question, and decides what happens based on your answer. But the way it phrases its deal ensures that no matter what you say, it can twist the outcome. It's a warning about systems or people that appear to offer fairness while actually creating traps. In the end, the crocodile paradox isn't meant to be solved. It's meant to be noticed. It invites us to look closely at how we understand truth, promises, and decision-making. Sometimes, the problem isn't in the choices we make. It's in the way the game is set up in the first place. So if you ever find yourself faced with a choice that seems impossible, where every option leads to contradiction, take a step back. Ask not just what the best answer is, but whether the question itself makes any sense. Because sometimes the real puzzle isn't about winning. It's about realizing the game was never fair to begin with. The Barber Paradox. In a small town, there's a barber with a simple rule. He shaves only those men who do not shave themselves. The barber, according to the rule, does not shave anyone who shaves themselves. Now, the paradox arises when we ask, who shaves the barber? Let's break this down. If the barber shaves himself, then he must follow the rule and not shave anyone who shaves themselves. But this creates a contradiction, because the barber is shaving himself, which means he should not be shaving himself according to the rule. On the other hand, if the barber does not shave himself, then he must follow the rule and shave anyone who does not shave themselves, including himself. But then, if he shaves himself, he violates the rule again. This simple-seeming situation leads to a logical impasse. It's impossible for the barber to fit neatly into the system without breaking the rule. The Barber Paradox, at first glance, might seem like just a quirky riddle, but it highlights an important issue in logic and set theory. The paradox arises because it involves a self-referential situation where the barber is both part of and outside the rule he is meant to follow. This creates a loop, making it impossible to decide whether the barber should shave himself or not. The paradox mirrors a deeper problem in mathematics and logic, similar to the well-known liar paradox, where statements refer to themselves in a way that leads to contradictions. The paradox also sheds light on how language and rules interact. We typically think of rules as clear instructions that apply without exception, but when the rule itself is part of the situation, it becomes more difficult to follow. It's as if the rule about who the barber should shave is both universal and specific to the barber at the same time, creating a situation where the rule is no longer helpful. In real life, this situation doesn't happen because the rules we follow don't usually lead to self-referential contradictions. But in the abstract world of logic, these kinds of paradoxes force us to reconsider how we define and apply rules. The Barber Paradox is a perfect example of a problem in set theory, a branch of mathematics that studies collections of objects. The paradox is related to a more general issue known as Russell's paradox, which was discovered by the philosopher and logician Bertrand Russell. Russell's paradox deals with the idea of a set of all sets that do not contain themselves. This kind of self-referencing set leads to a contradiction because it becomes impossible to determine whether such a set contains itself or not. The Barber Paradox is a simpler version of this idea, but it works in the same way, by creating a set of men who are both included and excluded by the rule at the same time. What makes the Barber Paradox especially fascinating is that it shows how certain logical systems break down when they try to define something that depends on itself. The paradox suggests that not all situations can be neatly classified into categories. Sometimes, the process of categorization itself can lead to contradictions. In this case, the barber is both someone who shaves and someone who doesn't, depending on how you look at it. This creates a breakdown in our understanding of the system's rules and forces us to confront the limits of logic. Even though the Barber Paradox is purely hypothetical, it has real-world implications. It encourages us to think more carefully about the assumptions behind the rules we create. In a broader sense, it asks us to reflect on how systems of rules and categories can sometimes fail or become self-defeating. For example, when designing a law, a system of government, or a social policy, we need to make sure that the rules we create do not lead to contradictions. Otherwise, the very systems that are meant to regulate behavior could become unworkable. Despite its paradoxical nature, the Barber Paradox isn't just a brain teaser. It's a reminder that even seemingly simple concepts like rules and categories can have unexpected consequences when they involve self-reference. It shows us the power and potential danger of self-referential statements and challenges us to think more critically about the limitations of logic. The Barber Paradox encourages us to consider the boundaries of systems and how they may break down when pushed to their extremes. In the end, the Barber Paradox doesn't have a resolution. It's meant to illustrate a deeper truth about logic and how certain problems defy easy answers. It reminds us that in the world of abstract thought, not everything can be neatly defined, and not all rules can be followed without leading to contradictions. The paradox is an invitation to think about the nature of rules, categories, and self-reference, and how these concepts shape the systems we build in logic and in life. Card Paradox. There's a strange little thought experiment that fits in the palm of your hand, but it can twist your brain into knots. It's called the Card Paradox. At first glance, it seems like a simple puzzle involving two sides of a card and two short sentences. But the moment you try to figure out if those sentences are true or false, logic starts to break down, and you find yourself in the middle of a paradox that's hard to escape. Here's how it goes. Picture a single card with writing on both sides. On one side it says, "The sentence on the other side of this card is true." You flip the card over, and on the other side it says, "The sentence on the other side of this card is false." That's it. Just two short lines, one on each side. But these two little statements create a loop that doesn't settle into any clear truth. Let's walk through it slowly. Start with the first side. The sentence on the other side of this card is true. Okay, so now we assume the other side, the one that says, "The sentence on the other side of this card is false," is true. But if that sentence is true, it's saying the first sentence is false. So we started by assuming the first sentence is true, but we just ended up proving it false. That doesn't make sense. Now try going the other way. Assume the first sentence is false. That means the second sentence, which it refers to, must be false. So if "the sentence on the other side of this card is false," then the sentence on the other side is not false. In other words, it's true. But that sentence was the one we just called false. So again, we're trapped in a cycle of contradiction. No matter how you try to label the two sentences, true or false, they seem to undo each other. If one is true, the other has to be false, but that falsehood ends up flipping the first one again. It's like standing between two mirrors and watching your reflection bounce back and forth into infinity. Each side refers to the other in a way that won't settle into something solid. This is what's known as a self-referential paradox. The problem doesn't come from confusing language or hidden tricks. It comes from the structure of the statements themselves. They loop into each other in a way that keeps flipping truth and falsehood endlessly. It's a smaller, more playful version of the famous liar paradox, where someone says, "This sentence is false. If it's true, then it's false. If it's false, then it must be true." The card paradox adds an extra layer by using two sentences, but the trap remains just as tight. Why do puzzles like this matter? For one thing, they help us understand the limits of logic and language. We often assume that everything can be neatly labeled as true or false, right or wrong. But paradoxes like the card paradox show that some ideas slip between the cracks of those neat categories. They don't just confuse us, they reveal how complex our thinking really is. In philosophy and logic, these kinds of paradoxes are more than just clever games. They challenge the foundations of how we define truth. They also help people who study language, mathematics, and even computer science think about problems in new ways. Self-reference shows up in programming, artificial intelligence, and decision-making systems. Knowing how to spot and handle these loops is part of building smarter, more reliable systems. But even beyond all that, the card paradox is fun because it turns something so small and simple into a deep and puzzling experience. It shows how powerful words can be, not because of what they describe, but because of how they're arranged. A sentence doesn't need to be long or complex to raise big questions. Sometimes it just needs to point at itself. So the next time someone hands you a card with writing on both sides, pause before you decide what it means. Because sometimes even the smallest sentences can lead you into a maze of logic with no clear way out. Gabriel's Horn Paradox. Gabriel's horn has a finite volume, which means it can hold a limited amount of paint inside. However, its surface area is infinite, which means it would take an endless amount of paint to cover the outside. That's the paradox. How can something be filled up completely on the inside, but never be fully painted on the outside? Let's take a closer look at how this horn is made. Imagine starting with a graph of the curve y equals 1x. This curve starts at x equals 1 and gets closer and closer to the x-axis as x increases, but it never quite touches it. Now, spin this curve around the x-axis to make a three-dimensional shape. What you get is Gabriel's horn, a long twisting trumpet that goes on forever, getting thinner and thinner as it stretches out. Now comes the surprising part. If you calculate the volume of this shape using calculus, the answer turns out to be a fixed number. It's not infinite, it's actually equal to pi. That means you could, in theory, fill the entire horn with a finite amount of paint, as long as it was just being poured inside. No matter how long the horn stretches, the amount of space inside it adds up to a number that doesn't go on forever. But when you try to calculate the surface area, the total amount of space on the outside that would need to be painted, that number doesn't stop. It keeps growing and growing. The further out you go on the horn, the more surface there is to cover. Even though the shape is getting narrower and narrower, the area you have to paint adds up to infinity. So while you can fill the horn, you can never paint the whole thing. That's why this is also called the painter's paradox. This idea sounds impossible, even magical. How can something hold a limited amount of paint on the inside, but need an endless supply to paint the outside? But the math checks out, and that's what makes Gabriel's horn such a powerful and puzzling object. It pushes us to think more deeply about the difference between volume and surface area, and how infinity doesn't always behave the way we expect. In the real world, of course, no one can build an actual Gabriel's horn. We can't make something that goes on forever. But as a thought experiment, it shows how strange things can get when we deal with infinity. It's a reminder that our everyday experience with space, size, and shape only goes so far. Math allows us to explore ideas that go beyond what we can see or touch. Gabriel's horn also raises interesting questions about physical reality. If you could build something like this, what would it mean? Could you really fill something infinite with a bucket of paint? Could you ever clean it, measure it, or touch all of its surface? The paradox sits at the edge of math and philosophy, challenging the way we think about objects and the limits of knowledge. In a way, Gabriel's horn is not just a shape, it's a symbol. It represents how the world of ideas can be full of surprises. What seems obvious on the surface can turn out to be much more complicated underneath. And sometimes, what we think is impossible becomes real, at least in the world of numbers and logic. So while you'll never hold Gabriel's horn in your hands, its lesson sticks with you. It teaches that infinity is not just a word, it's a powerful concept that bends our understanding. And even in something as simple as a trumpet-shaped curve, there can be a mystery big enough to stretch forever. Newcomb's Paradox. Let me ask you one simple question. Would you trust a prediction about your future if it meant giving up something that's right in front of you? On the surface, it seems like a basic decision, but underneath, it opens a deep discussion about free will, prediction, and how we make choices. Here's how the game works. You're presented with two boxes. Box A is clear and contains $1,000. Box B is sealed. You're told that Box B contains either $1 million or nothing at all. You have two choices. You can take only Box B, or you can take both boxes. Now here's the twist. Before you arrived, a highly intelligent predictor, a computer, a being, a force, had already made a prediction about what you would choose. If the predictor thought you would take only Box B, then it put $1 million inside it. If the predictor thought you would take both boxes, then it left Box B empty. This predictor has been right in the past almost every time. So now you're standing in front of these boxes. You can clearly see $1,000 in Box A, but Box B is a mystery. If the predictor guessed you'd be greedy and take both, then Box B is empty. But if it believed you'd take only Box B, trusting its prediction, then there's $1 million waiting for you. What do you choose? At first, it feels like a simple gamble. Why not take both boxes? After all, the prediction has already been made. Box B either has the money or it doesn't. You can't change what's already inside by making a choice now, right? If it has $1 million, great. You get that plus the $1,000. If not, at least you walk away with something. That seems logical. But then, a different thought creeps in. The predictor has always been right. People who choose only Box B almost always end up with $1 million. Those who pick both end up with just $1,000. Somehow your decision still seems connected to what's inside the box, even though it was made before you arrived. That's the heart of the paradox. It feels like the future is shaping the past. So what's going on here? Newcomb's Paradox is a battle between two ideas. On one side is expected utility, the idea that you should always choose the option that gives you the most benefit. According to that logic, two boxes should be better than one. On the other side is trust in the prediction. If you believe the predictor is rarely wrong, then the best strategy is to take only Box B. The paradox plays with our sense of time and cause. Can a prediction be so perfect that it controls what we do? Or are we truly free to choose, no matter what was expected? Some people argue that once the prediction is made, your choice can't affect it. So take both. Others say that the whole point is that your decision is part of what was predicted. So take one. This strange situation reflects bigger questions about life. How much do we really control our decisions? If someone could predict your every move, would you still feel free? And when we act based on beliefs about the future, trust, risk, or expectation, are we making choices or just playing out a pattern? Newcomb's Paradox doesn't offer a clear answer. People continue to argue over the best choice. It splits logic into two powerful sides, each with its own reasons. And that's what makes it such a fascinating idea. It's not just about money or prediction. It's about how we think, how we trust, and what we believe about time and decision-making. In the end, Newcomb's Paradox isn't a test with a correct answer. It's a mirror that reflects how we think about choice. Do we rely on logic alone, or do we trust something deeper, even if it doesn't quite make sense? Either way, The paradox shows just how tricky it can be to understand free will, even when the rules are clear and the boxes are sitting right in front of us. Maxwell's demon. In the world of physics, one of the biggest and most important ideas is the second law of thermodynamics. It says that things naturally move from order to disorder, and energy spreads out over time. That's why hot coffee gets cold and why you can't unmix cream from your coffee once it's stirred in. But in the 1800s, a man named James Clerk Maxwell came up with a clever little thought experiment to challenge that law. He introduced a tiny creature, not something real, just an idea, that became known as Maxwell's demon. And this demon created a paradox that still fascinates scientists today. Here's how the paradox works. Imagine you have a box filled with gas. This gas is made up of tiny particles, all zipping around at different speeds. Some are moving quickly, some more slowly. Normally, over time, the energy spreads out evenly, and the gas reaches the same temperature throughout. That's just how nature works, and it follows the second law. But Maxwell asked, what if there were a tiny creature who could watch every gas particle? This little demon stands at a door in the middle of the box, which is divided into two sides. Whenever a fast-moving particle comes along from the left, the demon quickly opens the door to let it through to the right side. And when a slow-moving particle comes from the right, the demon lets it pass to the left. Over time, the right side fills with faster particles, which means it gets hotter, and the left side ends up with slower particles, which means it gets colder. Now, here's the strange part. This process seems to create a temperature difference without adding any extra energy. One side of the box is hot, the other cold, and the demon made that happen just by sorting the particles. But according to the second law of thermodynamics, this shouldn't be possible. Heat naturally flows from hot to cold, not the other way around. You shouldn't be able to reverse this process without putting in work or using energy. Yet Maxwell's demon seems to break this rule effortlessly. That's the paradox. How can this imaginary demon create order from chaos, cool one side of the box and heat the other without doing any work? It challenges the very foundation of what we believe about energy, disorder, and the natural flow of time. For years, scientists debated whether the demon really broke the rules or if there was something they were missing. Eventually, the answer came not from classical physics, but from a deeper look into information and computation. In the 20th century, researchers realized that the demon's job isn't as simple as it seems. In order to sort the particles, it has to measure them, record their speeds, and remember which ones it let through. That means the demon is storing information. Here's the key. Storing and especially erasing information has a physical cost. According to a principle called Landauer's principle, erasing information in a computer or brain, or even in the mind of a tiny demon, produces heat. So, when the demon clears its memory to make room for more measurements, it creates disorder somewhere else. That disorder balances out the order it created in the gas. In the end, the second law still stands. Maxwell's demon doesn't actually break the rules. It just helps us understand them better. It showed scientists that information and energy are closely connected. What we know, how we measure, and what we choose to forget all have consequences in the physical world. That's a powerful idea, and it connects physics with computing, logic, and even the way we think. Today, Maxwell's demon is more than a clever puzzle. It's a symbol of curiosity and a reminder that even the most solid laws of nature can be questioned. Not because they're wrong, but because every question helps us dig deeper into how the universe works. And sometimes it takes an imaginary creature at the edge of a gas-filled box to open the door to new knowledge. Moral luck paradox. We all like to believe that people should be judged based on their intentions, decisions, and actions, not on random events they can't control. That feels fair. If two people do the same thing for the same reason, they should be treated the same way. But the moral luck paradox challenges that idea in a deep and troubling way. It asks, what if two people make the same choice, but the outcomes are different purely because of luck? Should we still judge them the same? Let's say two drivers, Alice and Ben, are both driving home late at night. They're both tired, distracted, and speeding just a little. Neither of them sees anyone on the road. But then something unexpected happens. A pedestrian suddenly steps in front of Alice's car, and despite trying to stop, she hits the person. The pedestrian dies. Ben, on the other hand, drives the same way, in the same conditions, but no one steps in front of him. He makes it home safely. Now here's the tricky part. Both Alice and Ben behave the same. Their choices, actions, and even their mindset were nearly identical. But Alice ends up in court, possibly even facing prison time, while Ben goes home and probably forgets the night that happened. Why? Because of something entirely out of their control. Luck. This is what philosophers call moral luck, when someone's moral responsibility is affected by factors beyond their control. The paradox becomes even more uncomfortable when we apply it to real life. Imagine two surgeons who both perform a risky but necessary operation. They use the same method and have the same skill. One patient survives, the other dies. One surgeon is praised, the other may be blamed or even sued. Again, the outcomes are different, but the actions were the same. Is it fair? Our instinct says no. It feels unfair to punish someone for bad luck or reward them for good luck when their actions were the same. But in practice, we do it all the time. Our judgments about people often depend on what happens afterward, not just what they intended to do. And that's where the paradox lives, in the space between fairness and reality. Some philosophers argue that we should only judge people based on what they can control: intentions, choices, effort. These are the things that define moral responsibility. If someone meant well and acted reasonably, they shouldn't be blamed just because something unlucky happened. Others say that consequences matter. If harm was done, it can't be ignored, even if it wasn't completely the person's fault. This debate touches everything from criminal law to ethics to everyday relationships. Think about parenting, for example. Two parents might make the same decisions, but one child grows up happy and healthy, while another struggles. People might say one parent was better than the other, but is that really true? Or was it just luck, something no one could predict? The moral luck paradox forces us to face uncomfortable questions about justice and fairness. It shows that life is messy and that simple answers don't always fit. It reminds us that people are often judged not just for what they do, but for what happens around them, things they never asked for or expected. So how do we deal with this? One approach is to be more careful about how we judge others. Instead of jumping to conclusions based on results, we can look closer at intentions and effort. We can also admit that luck plays a bigger role in life than we like to think. That doesn't mean ignoring consequences or avoiding responsibility, but it does mean showing more understanding. The moral luck paradox doesn't have a perfect solution, but that's what makes it so powerful. It opens up a space for reflection, for humility, and for compassion. Because in the end, we're all riding the waves of luck in one way or another, And sometimes the difference between blame and praise is just a moment we never saw coming. Simpson's Paradox. Sometimes numbers can tell a story that seems clear, obvious, even convincing. But then, when you look a little closer, the story flips on its head. That's the strange world of Simpson's Paradox, a statistical puzzle where a trend appears in different groups of data but disappears or even reverses when those groups are combined. It's confusing, surprising, and a bit unsettling, especially when it shows up in real-world situations like medicine, education, or social issues. To see how this works, picture two hospitals. Hospital A and Hospital B both perform surgeries. If you look at the overall success rates, Hospital A seems much better. It has a higher percentage of successful operations. But when the data is broken down into two groups, simple surgeries and high-risk ones, you suddenly find that Hospital B actually does better in both cases. How is that even possible? It all comes down to how the data is grouped and how different-sized groups can hide the full picture. Maybe Hospital A handled mostly simple surgeries with a high success rate, while Hospital B took on many more difficult cases. When everything is added together, the numbers get skewed. Even though Hospital B performed better in both types of surgeries, its overall rate looked worse, simply because it dealt with harder cases. That's Simpson's Paradox in action. It's not just a quirk of numbers, it happens in real decisions. Take college admissions. Suppose two departments in a university each admit a higher percentage of female applicants than male applicants. But when all the departments' data is combined, it might look like fewer women were admitted overall. The conclusion could seem like bias, but the truth may be that more women applied to departments with lower acceptance rates, while more men applied to departments with higher ones. The numbers suggest one thing at the surface, but the reality underneath is different. This paradox shows us how easy it is to be fooled by data when we don't pay attention to context. Numbers are powerful, but they can also mislead, especially when we forget to ask how the numbers were grouped, what's missing, or whether we're comparing apples to oranges. The paradox isn't just about statistics. It's about how we understand the world and how easily we can be tricked by what looks like clear evidence. Simpson's Paradox teaches an important lesson. Always be curious about the details. It's not enough to glance at a graph or a percentage and assume you know the truth. Sometimes the truth hides in the breakdown, in the subgroups, or in the story behind the numbers. This is especially important when making decisions that affect people's lives. In public health, for example, treatments might look ineffective in the big picture, but work very well for specific age groups or risk levels. Ignoring those subgroups could lead to the wrong choices. Even in sports, this paradox pops up. A player might have a higher batting average than another player in every season, but when their total stats are added up, the second player comes out ahead. It's strange, but it happens. The key factor is how much weight each season carries, how many games were played, or how many at-bats occurred. The overall average can be pulled in odd directions depending on those group sizes. So what should we do when we face Simpson's Paradox? The answer isn't to distrust data. It's to use it more wisely. Always look deeper. Ask questions. Break things down. And don't jump to conclusions based only on surface-level summaries. In a world full of charts, statistics, and percentages, this paradox is a powerful reminder that understanding data is not just about math. It's about context, interpretation, and a willingness to see what might be hidden behind the first layer. In the end, Simpson's Paradox doesn't just challenge our logic. It humbles us. It reminds us that the truth is often more complex than it first appears, and that careful thinking always beats quick conclusions. Unexpected hanging. A judge tells a prisoner something strange. "You will be hanged at noon on one weekday next week," the judge says, "but the execution will be a surprise. You won't know the day of the hanging until the executioner comes for you." The prisoner thinks carefully. If the hanging must be a surprise, then he should be able to figure out which day it can't happen, until, somehow, it seems like it can't happen at all. But then the execution comes, and he is surprised. That's the heart of the unexpected hanging paradox, a puzzle that seems simple at first, but quickly twists into something deeper and more confusing. Let's follow the prisoner's reasoning step by step. He starts by thinking about Friday. If he makes it through to Thursday night without being hanged, then the hanging must happen on Friday. But that wouldn't be a surprise because he'd expect it. So Friday is ruled out. Now he thinks about Thursday. If Friday is off the table, then if he reaches Wednesday night unharmed, the only option left is Thursday. But again, he'd expect it, so Thursday must be ruled out too. Using the same logic, he eliminates Wednesday, then Tuesday, and finally Monday. One by one, he crosses off every day of the week. Eventually, the prisoner feels safe. He believes that the judge's statement must have been a trick, or maybe even a mistake. If the hanging can't be a surprise on any day, then it can't happen at all, right? But then, on Wednesday, the executioner comes. The prisoner is shocked. He didn't expect it, which means the judge's statement was true after all. The hanging did happen, and it was a surprise. This is where the paradox lives. The prisoner's logic seems airtight, yet it leads to a false conclusion. He thinks he's found a contradiction in the judge's words, but the contradiction is actually in his own reasoning. The surprise is real, even though he thought he had reasoned it away. So, what went wrong? Part of the issue is that the prisoner is using logic to predict a surprise, but surprises, by their nature, resist that kind of prediction. He's trying to apply certainty to something that is meant to be uncertain. In doing so, he ends up stuck in a loop. Each time he rules out a day, it only works if the hanging hasn't happened yet. But once it does happen, all of that reasoning collapses. Some philosophers see this paradox as a conflict between logic and knowledge. It shows how our understanding can fall apart when we try to analyze uncertain situations with strict, step-by-step reasoning. Others think the paradox comes from the idea of self-reference. The prisoner's prediction is based on his own expectations, which are shaped by the very prediction he's trying to make. The unexpected hanging paradox also touches on bigger ideas about surprise, belief, and how we process information. We often try to predict the future based on patterns and logic. That usually helps us. But sometimes life throws something at us that doesn't follow the pattern. That's when surprises happen. And sometimes trying too hard to expect a surprise ends up making us blind to it. In everyday life, this paradox might not show up with such dramatic stakes, but the idea behind it still applies. Think of someone planning a surprise party. If the person being surprised starts to guess every possible day, they might think they've ruined it for themselves. But when the party actually happens, they're still caught off guard. The surprise works, not because it defied logic, but because their own logic led them to believe it couldn't happen. The unexpected hanging paradox reminds us that not everything can be predicted or broken down by strict rules. Some things only make sense after they happen. And sometimes, believing you've figured it all out is exactly what sets you up for the biggest surprise. Olbers' Paradox. Look up at the night sky. What do you see? Probably a dark background dotted with tiny, twinkling stars. That's what we've all seen for as long as we can remember. But here's the strange thing. Based on what we know about the universe, the night sky shouldn't be dark at all. It should be bright. Not just a little bright, but glowing everywhere, all the time. That's the mystery at the center of Olbers' paradox. The question is simple. If the universe is infinite, filled with stars in every direction, and has existed forever, then why is the night sky dark? It seems like every line of sight should eventually land on a star, and the entire sky should be blazing with light. But that's not what we see. The darkness feels natural to us, but when you think about it from a scientific perspective, it becomes confusing. This puzzle was named after Heinrich Wilhelm Olbers, a German astronomer from the 1800s. He didn't come up with the paradox himself. Others before him had asked similar questions, but he helped bring attention to it. He believed that something must be blocking the light, like clouds of dust. At first, that explanation seems to make sense. Maybe all the space between stars is filled with stuff that absorbs light. But there's a problem. If the universe had existed forever, those dust clouds would eventually heat up and start glowing too. They'd end up adding to the brightness rather than hiding it. So the paradox remained. If the universe is infinite and eternal and stars are everywhere, why aren't we bathed in light? The solution didn't come until much later, with the development of modern astronomy and our understanding of how the universe works. The biggest answer is that the universe is not eternal. It had a beginning. Around 13.8 billion years ago, everything we see started with the Big Bang. That means light has only had a limited amount of time to travel. Even though there may be countless stars far away, their light hasn't had enough time to reach us yet. The darkness we see is partly because we're looking into a cosmic past that hasn't fully arrived. Another reason is that the universe is expanding. As it stretches out, the light from distant stars and galaxies gets stretched too, turning into longer wavelengths. This is called redshift. Some of that stretched light is no longer visible to the human eye. It becomes part of the invisible microwave background, the faint whisper of the Big Bang still echoing through space. So even though the sky is technically filled with ancient light, much of it is now beyond our vision. Olbers' paradox helps us see how questions about something as ordinary as night can lead to extraordinary insights. What seems like a simple observation, the sky is dark at night, turns into a doorway into cosmology, the age of the universe, and the very structure of space and time. It teaches us that reality is often stranger than it looks, and that big answers can come from small questions. This paradox also reminds us of how science changes. What once looked like an unsolvable mystery is now mostly explained by what we've learned about the universe's beginning, its age, and its constant expansion. But it also shows that our journey to understand the universe is ongoing. There's always more to explore, more puzzles to solve, and more mysteries hiding in plain sight. So the next time you look up at the night sky, remember that the darkness itself carries meaning. It's not just empty space. It's a sign of where we are in the universe, how far light has traveled, and how much we've come to understand. What looks like nothing at all is actually a silent message from the cosmos, waiting to be heard. The Grand Hotel Paradox. Imagine you walk into a hotel called the Grand Hotel that has an infinite number of rooms. Each room is numbered 1, 2, 3, and so on, all the way to infinity. Now, this might sound strange, but the hotel is fully booked. Every room is occupied. At first glance, this might seem like a problem if a new guest arrives and wants a room. But the hotel's management has a surprising solution. The manager explains that even though all the rooms are filled, there's still a way to accommodate a new guest. The solution is simple yet mind-boggling. Move every guest from their current room to the next room. For example, guest 1 moves to room 2, guest 2 moves to room 3, and so on. This creates space in room 1 for the new guest, and the hotel still has all its rooms filled. It's clever, right? But here's where things get even stranger. What if an infinite number of new guests show up? The hotel is already full, yet the manager can still find a way to fit them all in. Instead of moving guests to the next room, the manager moves each guest to a room number that is double their original room number. So, guest 1 moves to room 2, guest 2 moves to room 4, guest 3 moves to room 6, and so on. This opens up all the odd-numbered rooms, 1, 3, 5, 7, etc., for the new guests, and now every new guest can be assigned a room. This is the Grand Hotel Paradox. It's a perfect example of how infinity behaves in ways that don't fit with our usual understanding. In a normal hotel, if every room is full, there's no more space for anyone else. But with an infinite number of rooms, there's always room for more guests, no matter how many arrive. The paradox helps us explore some surprising and confusing qualities of infinity. While most of us think of being full as meaning there's no more room left, infinity changes that idea. Even though the hotel is fully booked, there's no such thing as being full because there are always ways to make more space. This doesn't just apply to hotels, it's a challenge to the way we think about numbers and limits. In the world of infinity, things don't always behave the way we expect them to. The Grand Hotel Paradox isn't just a quirky thought experiment, it teaches us important lessons about the nature of infinity. When something is full in the real world, we understand it's full. But infinity doesn't work that way. It's always possible to create new possibilities, new spaces, or new solutions. The paradox invites us to think differently about what it means for something to be full, especially when infinity is involved. For mathematicians, the paradox highlights the strange behavior of infinity. In calculus, for example, infinity plays a key role in understanding limits and infinite series. The Grand Hotel Paradox is a simple way to demonstrate how infinity can be applied to real-world situations in surprising ways. Even though it's a fun intellectual puzzle, the paradox pushes us to reconsider how we understand the world around us. It's a reminder that there are concepts, like infinity, that don't always follow the rules we're used to. The Grand Hotel Paradox challenges our thinking and helps us appreciate how vast and strange the idea of infinity truly is. Even when a situation seems impossible to solve, like fitting in an infinite number of new guests, infinity always offers a solution. There's always room for more. In conclusion, the Grand Hotel Paradox isn't just about a hotel with endless rooms. It's about how infinity works in unexpected ways, offering us new ways to think about space, numbers, and logic. It reminds us that sometimes the rules we use to understand the world don't apply when infinity is involved, and that's what makes this paradox so fascinating. Service of recovery. Think about a place or system where help is always available. Maybe a hospital, a crisis hotline, or emergency rescue services. These systems exist to support people during difficult moments, to catch them when they fall, to restore what's broken. Now here's the strange part. Sometimes, the more effective a recovery service becomes, the more people rely on it, and this reliance can start to change behavior in unexpected ways. That's the heart of the service of recovery paradox. At first, recovery services are created to respond to rare, serious problems. A fire department is there in case of fire. Rehab centers exist for those struggling with addiction. Technical support exists for when systems break down. These services are a safety net, not something people are supposed to lean on all the time. But the better and more available the safety net becomes, the more people may come to depend on it. And over time, some might even become careless, knowing that help is just a call away. Here's where the paradox takes shape. The better the recovery, the more people feel safe taking risks. In a way, the system that's meant to reduce damage might actually encourage the very behavior that causes the damage. It's like someone who drives recklessly because they know their car has excellent airbags and strong brakes. The tools designed to protect them end up lowering their caution. This doesn't mean that recovery services are bad, far from it. They save lives, restore hope, and help people get back on track. But the paradox lies in how human behavior responds to safety. When we know that mistakes can be fixed, some of us stop being as careful about avoiding those mistakes in the first place. It's not intentional, but it's part of how comfort and trust can subtly shape our choices. This pattern shows up in many areas. In finance, banks that are too big to fail might take greater risks, assuming they'll be bailed out. In healthcare, people may ignore preventative care because they expect treatment to be available later. In education, students might procrastinate, trusting that tutoring services or deadline extensions will save them at the last minute. In each case, the availability of recovery can reduce the motivation to prevent failure. So how do we solve this? Some say we need balance, strong support systems paired with personal responsibility. Recovery services should exist and be trusted, but not taken for granted. People should still be encouraged to avoid the problems those services are designed to fix. That means teaching, training, and creating a culture where prevention is valued as much as cure. Another idea is to design recovery systems that don't reward careless behavior. For example, car insurance companies often charge higher premiums to drivers who've had multiple accidents, even if all the repairs are covered. That discourages people from relying too heavily on the fix and encourages safer driving habits instead. The service of recovery paradox isn't about blaming people for needing help. Everyone needs help sometimes. The paradox is about awareness, recognizing how safety nets can shape behavior over time and how even the most well-intentioned systems can have side effects. It's a reminder that fixing problems is important, but preventing them in the first place is even better. So the next time you feel tempted to relax because help is nearby, remember this paradox. It's not telling you to avoid help. It's just asking, what would you do if that safety net weren't there? Would your choices change? Would you be more cautious, more responsible, more prepared? That question doesn't have a perfect answer, but thinking about it might just help you avoid the fall in the first place. The Grandfather Paradox. You have a time machine and you're eager to go back in time. You set it to a point in history, somewhere long before you were born, and find yourself standing in front of your grandfather when he was still young. You've always wondered about his life, so you decide to pay him a visit. But something happens along the way. In a twist of fate, you accidentally prevent him from meeting your grandmother, or worse, something happens that stops him from having children. If that happens, then your parents will never be born. Then how could you have ever existed? Now, here's where the paradox kicks in. If you were never born, how could you have traveled back in time to interfere with your grandfather's life in the first place? The fact that you're there to change the past creates a logical loop. If you erase the events that led to your birth, you would no longer exist to travel back in time to change those events. This creates a contradiction, as you can't both exist and not exist at the same time. That's the heart of the Grandfather Paradox. This paradox is not just a tricky puzzle, it reveals the confusing nature of time travel. Time, as we experience it, moves in one direction, from cause to effect. But when you introduce time travel, that flow can be disrupted. The Grandfather Paradox asks, what happens when you change the past in such a way that the future, and even your own existence, becomes impossible? This paradox challenges everything we know about time, cause, and effect, and our place in the timeline. There are different theories on how time travel might work, but none of them can fully resolve the paradox. One possibility is that the timeline would adjust itself to prevent contradictions. In other words, if you tried to change something significant, like stopping your grandfather from meeting your grandmother, the universe might correct itself in some way to make sure that the timeline remains consistent. This idea is called the self-consistency principle, which suggests that the past will always unfold in such a way that it doesn't lead to paradoxes. Another idea is that time travel could create alternate realities or parallel universes. In this scenario, if you go back in time and change something, you aren't erasing your existence. You're simply creating a new branch of reality. So, in one timeline, your grandfather never meets your grandmother and you never exist, but in another timeline, everything plays out as it should, and you continue to exist. This theory allows for the possibility of change without erasing your own existence, but it raises other questions about the nature of reality. Despite these theories, the grandfather paradox shows us that time travel, while fascinating, could lead to major complications. It forces us to question how time works and whether changing the past is even possible. It highlights how fragile our understanding of cause and effect is when we think about time travel. The paradox suggests that altering one small detail in the past could have unpredictable and possibly catastrophic effects on the future. While the grandfather paradox doesn't offer a clear solution, it does remind us of how delicate the fabric of time is. The paradox doesn't just exist to confuse us, it makes us think about the broader implications of our actions in both the past and the future. It asks whether time is truly fixed or if it can be bent and twisted without breaking everything in the process. In the end, the grandfather paradox serves as a reminder of the dangers of meddling with time. While time travel is a captivating idea, it might be more complex and dangerous than we think. It raises deep questions about what happens when we change things in the past and whether those changes can ever be fully understood. It suggests that sometimes the past may be better left untouched, and the best thing we can do is leave time's flow undisturbed.